a topic which I suspect we've had many interesting and important topics discussed in the last couple of days, and we will again today, but I think some of the issues that we will be considering in the next hour and a quarter can legitimately be said to be really at the top of the international agenda, particularly with the conference in Copenhagen just a few weeks away now. So to talk about trade and climate change, I've got a distinguished panel which is about to be even more distinguished in just a few minutes. But on my far right, Lord Stan, Nick Stan from the London School of Economics and Political Science, the world's finest Academy of Social Sciences. I can say that because I used to teach there. And of course, the author of the extremely well-known and well-regarded UK report on climate change. Next to Nick is Deepak Puri, Chairman and Managing Director of Moser Baer in India. Next to Deepak will be Shyam Saran, the Special Envoy to the Prime Minister of India on climate change, who, if he is not in the building, is very, very, very nearly in the building and will be with us very soon. Then we have Bill Reinsch, the President of the National Foreign Trade Council in Washington, D.C. And I have to say, many years ago, an old source of mine when I was a correspondent in Washington. Then we have Suresh Vaswani, Joint CEO of Wipro, and on my immediate right, Ben Vafayan, who after a distinguished corporate career in all sorts of places is right now CEO of Alcatel-Lucent in France, but still, Ben, you were telling me, the chairman of the British Confederation of British Industry panel on climate change. So you're straddling the channel. Nick, kick us off. I had a conversation with a leading expert on world trade just a few weeks ago, and I said to him, climate change and trade, tell me how the two go together. And he said, the two can go together in an entirely benign way, so that processes of carbon mitigation and economic globalization continue to enhance the lives of everyone. All policies can develop so that the world trading system comes to a grinding halt. He said it's that important to get things right. So what are the key issues that we should be looking at?
I think the first thing to understand is that the low carbon growth story.
Just press there's a little button on the. Oh, yes.
This one.
Yeah. No, you're fine.
It's shining green at me.
You'll be fine.
Can you hear me in the back there? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. The first thing to recognize in relation to the whole trade story is that the big growth story of the next 2 or 3 decades is low carbon technologies, energy efficiency. I mean, we're not talking about halting deforestation today, but that's obviously key as well. But let's focus just on the low carbon technologies and on energy efficiency. You can see now, let me just give 2 examples, how big these things could be. I was speaking in middle of September in New York to a gathering organized by New York State Pension Fund with a number of other pension funds, and they had got together a statement which they're putting to the world leaders around Copenhagen, saying that giving the importance to them as long-term investors of a strong global deal on climate change, so that the signals are right, so that the investments can take place, so that they themselves as fund managers can get behind what they see as the most important long-term opportunity. The people who signed that statement were managing $12 trillion of funds. Hi, Shyam. Lovely to see you. Good to see you. They're managing $12 trillion of funds. That's a measure of their judgment of these opportunities. I was 2 weeks before working in China with colleagues who are preparing the 12th five-year plan, which starts in January of 2011, will be published in 2010. They are seeing the long-term growth story in low-carbon technologies, and they're positioning China to be a major leader in that area. It's going to be a key theme of the 12th five-year plan, and as many people here, I'm a great admirer of Indian five-year plans, but how do I put this? China's five-year plans are even more serious than India's five-year plans. Those are two examples, completely different parts of the world in the month of September, of the way in which long-term investors are seeing the huge opportunities in this area if policy is right. Now, policy right means the right kinds of incentive structures, but it also means avoiding trade barriers. And I think that what we need as a world is a clear, strong outcome in Copenhagen in terms of a political deal, the months that follow, more formal agreements. And that will give us the kind of incentives that are necessary to unleash the kind of investment activities which we're talking about. And it will give us the opportunity to avoid the kind of protectionist trade measures which I think should be kept right out of this area. So we could slip back into accusations that others are not doing enough and imposing tariffs on them. I think it would be a downhill spiral. I think it's unnecessary, damaging, and it's up to us as people talking about policy, helping others, don't necessarily make policy, but helping others to understand and make policy, to make it clear that the right response to this is the collaborative one, and that is in our hands. We can avoid that.
Get the policy mix right, and this is a growth story. This isn't it, right?
Yep.
Shyam, Saran, welcome. Good morning. Thank you for joining us. I just asked Nick to set the stage on issues of trade and climate change policy as we approach Copenhagen. You gave a wonderful speech at the Carnegie Institute for International Peace earlier this year, in which you said very, very plainly that India was committed both to rapid economic growth, 9% growth, but that it felt that it could do so in a sustainable way and in a way that mitigated carbon emissions. Just tell us from the Indian perspective what you're looking forward to over the next 4 or 5 weeks as we roll up towards Copenhagen, and whether you think that Nick's optimistic scenario that if we get policy right, this can actually be a growth story, whether you think that has a reasonable chance of coming to fruition. The microphones, right there. Yeah.
Well, good morning to everyone, and I apologize for being late. Climate change is not the only challenge we face. I was behind a long line of cars at the gate because of another challenge that you are all aware of. So I apologize for being late. I have just come back from a week in Barcelona. That was the last session of the 2 ad hoc working groups that we have. The ad hoc working group on long-term cooperative action, and there is another group on the Kyoto Protocol. I'm afraid we ended the sessions without much cheer for Copenhagen in December. And I think the subject that you have for this morning session is one of the key reasons why we are not really getting to where we want to get in Copenhagen. Because I think on the one hand, we are talking about a very extraordinary challenge that we are facing, and a challenge which will have very long-term consequences for the whole of humanity. And I was just going through the book you presented me, Nick, yesterday on Planet in Peril. And I'm afraid the global discourse as it unfolds in the negotiating rooms, I'm afraid does not seem to reflect that sense of peril. And why does it not reflect that sense of peril? Because I think the entire debate has become intertwined with very, very real fears about economic prospects of countries, whether or not major economies of the world, developed economies of the world, would they be able to keep the standards of living that they enjoy at the moment? For developing countries, are their growth process going to be affected in any way? And because of this intertwining of very, very real economic interests and economic compulsions, I would say, we are really not getting, as I said, where we want to get. And the economic and financial crisis, the rhetoric is that, economic and financial crisis is actually a great opportunity for turning our economies green, and that if we make the investments which are required in renewable energy, in energy efficiency, these are things which will not only help us in overcoming the economic and financial crisis, but will really help us to accelerate the shift to a more sustainable growth path. But that's the rhetoric. The ground reality, believe me, is quite different. The economic and financial crisis has, in fact, dampened the enthusiasm for taking actions which are required on the climate change front. So, as far as a country like India is concerned, it should be quite apparent that if there is a country which has a great stake in a successful outcome at Copenhagen, it is a country like India, because we are going to be the most impacted by the consequences of climate change. We would like to have a supportive global climate change regime, which can, in fact, in a sense, help us do all the things that we are already doing in our own interests. But there is a limitation of resources. At the end of the day, we are a developing country. And if you look at what India is doing in terms of its National Action Plan or the various national missions, they are very, very ambitious. I mean, I'm just working on the National Solar Mission, and you are looking at an installed capacity of something like 20,000 megawatts in the next 10 to 12 years. And that's going to cost billions of dollars. And we are not making our action on climate change conditional upon what anybody else is going to do, or whether we are going to get support from outside or not. This we will do because it is good for India. But I think it is also legitimate on the part of India to expect that if we have to do more, then we need global support. And that is where I think the discussions which are taking place currently in the multilateral forum are not quite delivering what the developing countries are looking for. The expectations at Barcelona were downgraded. We are no longer looking for a legally binding outcome. People are talking about a political agreement. People are talking about, instead of our being able to reach a agreement in December this year, maybe it will take another year. So there is a very deliberate attempt to try and downgrade, international expectations. And that is unfortunate. Thank you.
Very good. I should say, I should have said this in the introduction, that the deliberations here will contribute to the forum's Global Redesign Initiative, which is this major piece of work that the forum is engaged in now, which will lead to its own separate conference later in the spring. And also at the end of this session, we're going to really try and get some short, key recommendations that can feed directly into to the closing plenary. We've got three very distinguished business leaders with us on the panel, and you just heard Mr. Saran say that there was a huge business opportunity here. So, Ben, let me start with you. You've been looking at this for a long time. Are corporations doing enough? Do they realize the opportunities there? Are they doing enough, both to take opportunities themselves and also to lead us to a carbon neutral or carbon diminished society?
So let me take 2 steps back. First of all, this is one of the subjects that's hard to imagine that you would take the conclusion and say, it's too difficult, let's do nothing. But a lot of the discussion now on the political front, strangely enough, where it started maybe by the business segment of society not being convinced, has now turned into a business segment that is more convinced than the policymakers. And the argument that we don't have the money to do it because there's a crisis, I like to remind everybody that in every crisis that we have seen in our history, there's always been a catalyst to coming out of the crisis. Whether it was internet in the 80s or whether it was radio in the 30s, there was always something. And here is a very fundamental opportunity to create another catalyst, and that's green. I have the distinct pleasure of being the chairman of the Business Climate Change Group in the UK, and we combined are responsible for 1% of world pollution. 18 CEOs and chairmen started by sitting like this, being there in order to make sure nothing would happen. And sometimes it feels that attitude is now going from the business to the policymakers. And I'm being harsh here, I realize that. It's difficult. But once you're convinced, and I think Nick Stern's report was the tipping point there, that this is not something that you can choose to ignore, the best way is to get on with life. So my plea is, set the bar high, and we will jump. That's what you will see in business. That is what happens. And I think that we have three crises right now. We have a financial economic crisis, that's true, understood, unfortunate, it's there. We have this climate change thing, but we have a third element. We have a crisis in confidence. People ask, societies ask, okay, we go from a G8 to a G20 reality. Are those guys capable of making policy decisions and then turn it into action? This is a fantastic opportunity to show that the new reality is more capable than the old reality. So every reason in the book to get on with life and start doing it.
Let's hear from Indian business leaders to see whether they recognize the opportunity and think that Indian business is in the same position as Ben says. Some leading West European countries are recognizing that there's a huge opportunity and also recognizing that things have to change. Suresh, do you want to go first, then Deepak?
Yeah, okay, so let me just make a few points. One is, in context of green imperialism, and one of the topic alludes to that. I think if we can get, all countries to look beyond boundaries and really look as the world as one, that would be a great thing to do, because clearly this is something that transcends all boundaries. What is manufactured in China, exported to the US, creates greenhouse in China, and then whose greenhouse gas is it anyway? So that's the first perspective. The second perspective is beyond policies and beyond developing countries and developed countries. I think corporations have to be a lot more aggressive and really take on the mantle of containing greenhouse gas emissions and do it with this great urgency. I would like to say that Wipro as a company has taken very, very aggressive steps insofar as containing greenhouse gas emissions is concerned. And we've done it because we're passionate about it, but more importantly, it is also a cost transformation initiative. So while you invest in technology, while you contain greenhouse gas emissions, I think you also do yourself good in terms of containing cost. One last point I would like to make as it relates to India. India has sort of revolutionized the IT services business globally. I think what I'm hearing from my colleagues here, all about green technology, all about greenhouse gas containment and the technology that goes into it, I think India can take a very, very proactive leadership role in it in terms of making proactive investments as it relates to India, in terms of making sure we educate our people and educate professionals coming out of colleges on green, and really create the next IT industry.
That's a perfect segue to Deepak. Is India ready?
Thank you.
Is Indian industry ready to take up that challenge?
Gentlemen, I think, thank you, Michael. I'm the only one out here on the panel just now who is from the hardcore, from the clean tech sector. We are manufacturers. We are looking beyond, as Suresh right now said, borders. We are working internationally and in India to see how clean tech sector, which is deemed to be $1 trillion baby, believe me, today clean tech, which encompasses hydro, solar, wind, biomass, ocean energy, and so many others, is a $125 billion sector. This is expected to increase to in 2020. I will come to what India is going to do. 2020 to 250 billion and $1 trillion opportunity in the year 2050. Ladies and gentlemen, here is the thing we should pursue. Even if that $1 trillion a year goes for 10 years, $10 trillion of investment translates to 50 to 60% of the world's energy coming from clean tech sector. I'll shift back to my country. India, ladies and gentlemen, well, at time to time used to be laughed at, but today is taken seriously because of one reason. We've surprised many. We took the pain of converting, and that was a very painful process, without any help, without anything, converted all Delhi transport to CNG. Who has done it? That's what I say. You may have clean diesel, but this is pure, absolutely green things now. This is one part of it. Government has already put in place, without external help, policies to help industry in the clean tech sector. They give 25% cash subsidy to anybody who sets up plants over here for the clean tech sector, specifically solar. I will not talk about the solar. I'll let Mr. Shyam Saran speak about it because he's the author of that policy, but I'll say one thing. That policy is going to be announced in, I think, another 10 days, or 4 days. And I can assure you, it is, as I say, that's the game of 2020. India invented the 2020, the shortest form of cricket. This will be a game, it's going to be the shortest form of mitigating the 20 gigawatt in 2020. So ladies and gentlemen, India will surprise you, I assure you.
Now, Bill, you've had tremendous optimism from our three corporate panelists that business is ready to step up, that business sees an opportunity, that business is ready to do its part. You've had Nick say that if we get policy right, there is a real growth story here. And you've had Shyam say that actually the policymakers are getting a little stuck. What are the key issues that we have to keep an eye on, both over the next few weeks as we come up towards Copenhagen and then on into 2010? From your vantage point in Washington, what are the things we've got to keep a look at?
Well, I'm happy to see the level of business enthusiasm here for this. I think that's repeated in the United States. I was a little bit discouraged by the report from Barcelona. You made it sound as though these negotiations are becoming like the Doha round, which is probably not the best thing we could hope for at this point, but perhaps we can try to lend a sense of urgency to the process. I think from our point of view, there are a lot of challenges here that are surmountable, but have to be dealt with one by one by all of us. I think for the Americans and the Europeans in particular, the challenges are first to not only agree to, but to implement significant, meaningful emission reduction targets. I think also the challenge is going to be to avoid adding on protectionist measures and trade barriers that are protectionist but are intended to limit imports of carbon-intensive products from countries that perhaps haven't adopted the targets. One way to avoid that, of course, is if everybody agrees to targets and we have a multilateral approach to the problem. Even in the absence of that, though, having those kinds of trade barriers are going to make the achievement of all of our goals a lot more difficult. And one of the things we're working very hard on is to try to make sure that that doesn't become a big impediment as far as the American legislation is concerned. In turn, I think the challenges for the developing countries, including India and China, but also many others, are first also to agree to targets that are meaningful and give global confidence that we're all working together to deal with a global commons problem. And also, I think their challenge, where a lot of progress has been made very recently, I think in particularly reflected in the statement the Prime Minister made here, on the intellectual property area. I think there's a growing appreciation amongst all parties, particularly in developing countries, that strong intellectual property protections is actually an enhancement to investment, an enhancement to R&D in their countries, and as a way for developing countries to protect green innovation and green technology that are very much going to be the products of India and China, and not simply of Europe and the United States. So I'm optimistic that we're moving in the right direction on that front, although there have been a lot of statements in the past that have suggested that was going to be a rocky area. One more thing that I hope we can tackle is an effort to produce an environmental goods and services trade agreement that will lower barriers, trade barriers, tariffs in particular, but also market access barriers to green technology. Right. That's going to benefit everybody, and because we're all purveyors of that technology.
It sort of strikes me, looking at this subject, that it's amazing that that hasn't happened, in a way. I mean, that just kind of seems... Ben, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, because the worst thing that can happen is that the climate issue is going to dominate the trade agenda in the wrong way. Then we get Doha plus Copenhagen into something that will be a dreadful situation.
Minsk or something like that.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't choose a place on earth for it, to be honest. But it's not out of the question that it will happen. And that will be absolutely a disaster for all of us.
Nick, are you genuinely worried that the possibility of protectionist measures sort of riding on the back of climate change policy has been raised a number of times now, of green tariffs or what have you? Are you genuinely worried that there is a possibility of that developing as a policy response in some countries?
I think there is a danger. They're usually slogans without analysis. People talk about leveling the playing field and environmental dumping, and we've all heard the language. But if you look at the costs associated with adopting green technologies, short-run investments is the way I prefer to, well, not just short-run, but I prefer to think of investments rather than costs. But even if you take a narrow view in terms of costs, you're talking on average cost increases of 1 or 2%. Right. When people are talking about tariffs, what do they want? They want 20%, they want 30%, they want exclusions. I mean, I think if you look at the numbers associated with the extra costs of going clean, they really don't justify the kind of protectionism that some people are seeking, and indeed they show it up as exactly that, as protectionism. So I think, we were discussing with Bill a little earlier, I think as far as possible, if those methods are deemed to be a part of a political deal within a country, if they're pushed out far enough, 2020, a possibility of, if progress hasn't been made in some sense, it's probably not too dangerous because the reality will have changed so much in the next 10 years. So I think the first and honest way of dealing with this story is just to show that the argument is wrong, in terms of quantities. The second way is say, let's all act together, which is the best way forward, a multilateral one. And the third way is to say, well, if this is, for short-sightedness, narrow view of self-interest, if this is going to have to be in a bill, whichever country you're looking at, or in a policy, whichever country you're looking at, push it out far enough, because I think then the reality will take over. But what we've got here is a problem of people not understanding what real self-interest is. They are consumed often with a very short-run perception, a narrow view of cost, so that somehow you get this artificial horse race between growth and climate responsibility. High carbon growth is basically over 2 or 3 decades a contradiction in terms. It kills itself, first on high hydrocarbon prices, and second on the very hostile physical environment that it creates. This is not a competition between growth and climate responsibility. We will get growth over the medium term only if we are climate responsible. And that next 2 or 3 decades will be, if we get it right, more important than the railways and the electricity in earlier periods of economic history. If you look at where spurts of growth come, if you take economic history over a couple of 100 years, they don't all come from technology. They don't all come, but some of them do. And this surely will be one of those if we get the policies right. And it's so important to get those who are discussing policy, and I've been in that position, and Shyam has been a really, and I've seen this happening, a really progressive and strong influence in this area. But it is important to get that perception of what the real choices are. And it is not between growth and climate responsibility. It's a totally false choice, an artificial horse race.
Shyam, is that, I've read your speeches on this, and you've been absolutely clear that it is a false choice to imagine that you have to choose between growth and climate responsibility. But is that understanding, as it were, embedded in Indian policy making?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you just look at the National Action Plan on Climate Change, which was adopted last year, what it says is that both for reasons of climate change as well as for energy security, if India does not make a graduated shift from its current reliance on fossil fuel-based growth to a strategy of growth which is based essentially on renewable sources of energy, cleaner sources of energy such as nuclear energy. And by the way, that was one of the very important reasons why the civil nuclear agreement was very important for India, giving it more energy choices and clean energy choices. So that is not in doubt at all that this is a shift that has to be made. Even if there was no climate change argument, this shift would still be important, because in a world of depleting fossil fuel resources, higher prices of energy, if you do not make that shift, the prospects of maintaining a growth rate of 8 to 9% per annum, which we believe is absolutely essential for poverty eradication in this country, would simply not be possible. So that is conceded. But I think we all have to recognize that the transitioning is something which requires mobilization of resources.
So what sort of, you mentioned in your first intervention, an expectation that there is, these are my words, a little help from the outside. What do you want the developed nations to do to make this transition a little easier?
Well, as I said, there is no doubt that India will do what it has to do, but within the limitation of its own resources. So there has to be a recognition that there are very complex challenges which countries like India face. It's not only a matter of reducing emissions. We have to mobilize resources, spend resources on adapting to climate change, which is taking place. Even if emissions became zero tomorrow, you would still have climate change taking place, and there would be a large amount of resources required in order to prepare the country, prepare the people to meet that challenge. And the other aspect is, of course, the investment that you need to make just for the sake of improving the lives of hundreds of millions of people. So it is a very complex developmental challenge you are facing. You know, climate change, development, all these are all interlinked in a country like India. So you cannot separate these strands. But what is it that one is looking for in terms of the global regime? It should not become a restrictive regime, which means that if you have today an argument, I mean the argument about intellectual property, for example, there is a misunderstanding of what countries like India and other developing countries are saying about IPRs. We are not saying that go and steal somebody's IPR. What we are saying is, if you are saying we are near the tipping point, if you are saying we are facing an extraordinary challenge and you need an extraordinary response, does it not make sense that the climate-friendly technologies which are available should be diffused in as rapid and as widespread a manner as possible, and create the capacities in developing countries so they can assimilate those technologies? Now, you need a global mechanism through which Okay? If it is necessary, you purchase those technologies. If you need to, license those technologies. Don't hurt the interests of the innovator. But then make them available as public goods to those who need them. Because if you do not do that, then you are not going to be able to deploy the kind of effort that you need to meet such a global challenge. Right. And the second part, if we also admit that we need transformational technologies for the future as one of the very important components of our response, that is very much part and parcel of how the United States of America is looking at this whole question of climate change, the need to get together a regulatory framework, get together an incentive framework which will allow you to generate those transformational technologies for the future. What we are saying is, can we not create a global platform on which the considerable scientific and technical resources which are available with countries like the United States, modest ones which are available with countries like India, can we not put that together and work together to provide those transformational technologies for the future? So why should we be looking at this only in a competitive frame of mind? Why can't we look upon this as something which requires collaboration, where we need to work together?
Bill?
I think those are noble goals and that we would probably all agree with. The details, of course, are important, and the terms of diffusion or the terms of cooperation are the issues that have to be discussed. I think if you're talking about the kinds of things you were talking about, licensing and things like that, that makes perfect sense. And I think the goal of innovators and people that create the products and the ideas and the technologies have a significant interest in diffusing them and getting them out there. And these are welcome statements. I think the only thing I'd say about it in addition, though, is, as you've just said, there are many things that all work together to make this a successful strategy or an successful strategy. In that case in particular, a government's policy on inward investment, its policy on joint ventures, its tax policy, in addition to its intellectual property policies, all interact in the question of how business, not only how, but where business wants to get together. I think American innovators have an interest in technology diffusion. They also have a lot of choices as to where that can take place. And if it's to take place with India, then I think there needs to be a discussion about whether Indian policies that can facilitate that are, whether India has policy that can facilitate that. And that means not just IP policies, but as I said, tax and investment policies as well.
Deepak, do you want to come in on as actually being in the industry itself?
Technology? Well, that's my forte. I'm a technologist, essentially. Let me get back to, whilst everybody is talking, we are enacting. We have on the ground today, one of the largest in India at least, crystalline silicon plants, fully operational, and that is working. We are working on research and development to increase the efficiencies, to take them up to the threshold which is possible physically, not theoretically. That's the first thing. Second, the world's first thin film line was on ground here, 80 megawatts, fully operational as of today. That's a US-India joint venture. Third, the world's first parabolic concentration technologies, again, US-India, was from here supplied to Spain. First, finally, and I must say this, we don't care for boundaries. We work for everybody and all around. We have an excellent R&D center sitting at Eindhoven where we are doing cutting-edge technology research with collaboration with our Indian, both are owned by us. In India, 86 PhDs are working. One thing which people don't realize, India has such a wealth of intellectual people and physicists, technologists within the government, and we have a very active collaboration with them. So these three combined together are working only 2 mandates, sir. And that will be what I say will be the game changer. First, when you expose a photovoltaic film or a photovoltaic panel to the sunlight, what happens? A minimum threshold of photonic activity is necessary, minimum threshold, before electronic activity takes place. We are working on How do we bring that minimum threshold down to such a level that even in twilight, that will produce electrical power? One last thing, sir. Second, the mandate to these people is we don't care how you do it. Reinvent even Einstein's theory if you want to. But I want to know, how do you bring down the cost of photovoltaics of some kind or solar to below or equal to hydro cost? Lastly, we are into hydro also. We are working at 12,000 feet. Beyond the Rohtang Pass, there are 3 dams we are building at 9,000 feet each. Thank you.
Ben, you wanted to go?
Yeah, it strikes me that one of the things we're struggling with is that experience have told us that international negotiations always have winners and losers. And that we're struggling here with an issue that if we do it right, maybe we have one of those things that you have winners and winners. But the perception is that it can't be true, and therefore we're looking to issues like IPR. Well, the reality will be that maybe this is not an issue for the United States, but this is an issue much more for Brazil and China and India, because there the innovation will take place. Where the perception, of course, is it always has been the way that the United States and Europe would have to be protecting, between brackets, their IPR positions against those who are simply applying them in their own markets. So where roles are changing, it could be that we still are having a shadow battle of the old world, where the new world has different realities. And I think business has a role to play to articulate that much louder and much clearer. Because if I listen to this discussion, it could very well be that in the name of business interests, things will happen that are truly not in the interest of business as it is configured today.
Very interesting point. Suresh, do you want to come in on that?
I just want to make a few points to my peers here. In software, we have the concept of open source, which is freely available technology to be used and to be adapted by different corporations. So listening to what Shyam was saying, if in the area of green technology, and I'm talking about countries who have the technologies, countries who don't have the technology, but if we can create the concept of open source, of using green technology that is made reasonably freely available to the world, which can then be customized by different countries for their own needs, I think that would be a great step forward. 2 more points I wanted to make, and I keep coming back to the corporations. I think corporations have a huge role to play, not only in terms of how you drive it as a corporate philosophy, but also as in how you create awareness with your various stakeholders. So I'll just give you a simple example. We've got some 5,000 volunteers insofar as green is concerned, and through that we've been able to actually monitor a number of instances of carpooling. And the last count was 20,000 instances of carpooling. So simple initiatives like this, which corporations, which large number of people involve all their stakeholders, if they can take those steps, I think it will grow a long way. And maybe last point from my side is, while all the deliberations are taking place and while all the discussions are taking place, the call for action, and I'm really stealing what Ben told me over tea earlier, the call for action is really now.
Right.
We need to execute, and we need to really execute with a tremendous pace, because the challenges are huge.
Let's see if we can get some questions from the audience. It's been an absolutely fabulous discussion. Gentlemen, just wait for microphones. Gentlemen here, if you could just identify yourself and then ask the question. Thanks.
One of the things which a brilliant panel like this does is to confuse some delegates like us. My proposition is that I believe that, whatever you have said in terms of facts, the world is one, it impacts the other. I think everybody knows that. However, you had USA not sign the Kyoto Protocol. Why? If you think of it, perhaps it is because the short-term interests are in priority compared to the long-term interests. Economy and growth are short-term interests. Climate change, as perceived by most of the business and other people, are long-term interests. And therefore, the short-term interest gain. I believe that the way forward is something which Mr. Saran talked about, is making the green technologies cheaper than the other technologies. Mr. Puri, you mentioned about the fact that there are subsidies available and so on. That is, according to me, uncertain and unsustainable as far as business is concerned. We don't know tomorrow whether that subsidy will be there or not. Therefore, don't you think that if there is a global cooperation in making sure that the green technologies, in terms of cost and quality, are the way forward, and there's a global cooperation, then I think we'll reach somewhere. No.
Okay.
No, I was just talking, you had mentioned about subsidy.
Okay.
I'm saying that is not
subsidy.
sustainable.
No, subsidy on
Okay, let's
on manufacturing.
To bridge the viability gap.
Yes.
You had talked about that.
Yes.
So I'm just addressing that. That's not sustainable,
Okay.
and it's uncertain. So I was just talking about that we got to hammer the thing by green technologies becoming successful economically.
No, that's what we are doing.
Bill, yeah.
On the first thing you said, and also reflect on a very important point that I think that Ben made, and that is we're in the middle of a paradigm shift here, which is what makes, I think, agreement so complicated. It's human nature to fight the last battle, and this is a situation where I think the array of strengths and weaknesses, if you will, have changed, and we're only now beginning to grasp that. When this debate began to intensify a number of years ago, the positions were conventional. The developed countries felt, well, we have all the technology, and we have to have strong standards, and we have to push the developing countries to agree to the standards. And the developing countries' response was, well, this is your fault. You need to clean up the mess before we do anything, and give us all your technology. And what we have begun learning as this debate has evolved, and as countries, including India, have moved very quickly, is that that's not the status quo anymore. A lot of the sources of innovation and technological development are in developing countries. And they have begun to appreciate, given their own environmental situations, how important it is for them to embark, as you said, on very strong environmental emissions reduction programs, not because it makes sense globally, because it makes sense for India or it makes sense for China. This is a paradigm shift that's very important, but one of the consequences, I think, is that it roils, if you will, the negotiations. It makes the prospect of coming to a conclusion more difficult because countries have had to sort of reevaluate on all sides where they stand. It leaves me, however, more optimistic than I was, say, a year ago, because it seems to me that the way this has changed in some respects is going to make resolution of a lot of these issues easier rather than more difficult. The bad news, if you will, it may make the issues a little bit more complicated in the United States and less complicated elsewhere, but that's something that we can work on.
Nick, you wanted to come in?
I think good policy is about generating for investments now the right kind of incentives so that the short-term incentives and the long-term incentives are aligned. That means taxing those things which are bad. I mean, it means carbon taxes. It means cap and trade schemes. It means regulation in some aspects of building, in some aspects of use of coal, in emissions from cars. It means a combination of policies like that so that those who are making the investments face the right kinds of costs. At the moment, if you don't put a price on greenhouse gases, essentially you're subsidizing pollution by not facing people with the price or the consequences of what they do. This is about making markets work well. It's not anti-market, it's about making markets work well, because if we don't have this kind of price, it's a market failure. I think we have to see strong policy as aligning short-term and long-term interests, and that's what good policy is about. This whole process will be one of dramatic change. In dramatic change, there's dislocation. Those who are going to suffer the dislocation notice and anticipate it, and governments hear very strongly from them. Governments hear from the coal industry, from oil and gas. Governments in Europe, in countries which make cars with bigger engines, get their ears bent and that's part of the story of what happened in Germany. This is a process where the voice of the people on the platform here, which is so convincing about what business can do and will do, and is started to do already, is something, I think, which governments have to hear very powerfully, because they genuinely think, these are not insincere people in government service. I've been in government service for 3.5 years of my life. There are decent, intelligent people trying to do their best, but they are not business people. That's not their world. They interpret the business world from what they hear from business people. So that's why I think the voice of the vision of change, the understanding of the reality of change, the understanding of what policies are going to bring change, is of fundamental importance in determining the outcome over these next weeks and months.
Deepak, you wanted to come in?
Madhu, I just wanted to clarify a statement. You said incentives are not very clear. The government has in place and legislated for an incentive for semiconductors, and solar is a semiconductor. In 2007, and that's the one I was talking about, they have 9 applications for dispersal right now. Ours is number 1, and that is it. That's all I was trying to say. So there is a place.
Gentleman here and then over here. In the middle first, please. They're racing with the microphones.
Nigel Austin from Arup, Nick. Just reading an article over breakfast this morning in the Mint, and I think there's probably a more fundamental issue that you've been addressing. Let me just read this short paragraph. This is by the Environment Minister. There is no conclusive scientific evidence to link global warming and the Himalayan glaciers, nor the link the black carbon in the atmosphere with the glaciers. We also cannot link retreating glaciers in the Arctic because of climate change to those in the Himalayas. I think we have a kind of more fundamental issue to deal with when you've got ministers and policymakers like this making statements in the Mint this morning.
Yep.
To conclusions. There is certainly anecdotal evidence that global warming is impacting on the Himalayas, and maybe some of the glaciers are melting. But the problem is that we do not have enough information available. And I think good policy making should be based on very accurate, very reliable data. And I think what the minister has been trying to say is that before we get into policy making and start putting in measures, it is very important for us to know precisely what is happening. And what he has done is, just a few weeks earlier, he has put in place a very major national project, bringing together glaciologists, bringing together people who are in the field, physicists, people who are climate experts, and also using our own satellite reconnaissance capabilities to give us an accurate picture of what really is happening in the Himalayas. Because what is happening is that there are certain areas where there is obviously some melting taking place. There are other areas where there seem to have been an increase in the mass of ice in the glaciers. So it is not very clear what precisely is happening in these areas. When he's saying, let us not jump to conclusions, let us study this further, we need to know more about this, I don't think he should be faulted for that.
Gentleman over there.
Great panel, except I was kind of little disappointed with the corporate response here, because I did not hear much concrete steps from the corporate sector. What will you do there, in especially the Indian corporate sector, for the 600 million people? Forget the government. Government will do its part. What, according to you, will you do to help create the infrastructure in the rural areas to promote the technology, not just waiting for every time an excuse, the government will do it and then we will go. And I don't want to hear marketing spills, but I just want to know concrete that Mr. Shyam Saran can actually help and create the infrastructure for renewable energy and decentralized energies to reach without subsidies in a sustainable way to the poor people in India. And that's one question to the corporate. And second to Mr. Shyam Saran is, are we thinking about the tax structure? Because if a street vendor in India buys solar, she's taxed. So is there anything in the offing that we will remove that tax structure for the poor to buy solar?
Thank you. Corporate response. Deepak, you wanted to say something? Ben, you wanted to say something?
Well, I didn't catch your name. Chandar, okay. Harish Chandar, okay. A company like ours currently is putting into place and is physically doing it as of today all over India, solar farms, and these are standalone farms, quite a lot of them. And they will supply electrical power to villages all around. That's the first. We have in place today solar products, which are one of the most inexpensive in the world. A solar lantern. Remember, a large number of Indians, I don't want to give statistical data, families do not have electrical power in their country, in their homes, and even a hut, and they use kerosene lamps. To replace them, we have the lowest cost solar lanterns in place today, which are community held. I mean, I think as a company itself, we are doing enough currently, but this effort will gain what I call as momentum as we go forward. This is just started by us. And I agree with you. We are one company. We don't depend on any kind of subsidies. Look, I was the first one to propagate the 20-year-old, the cash subsidy which the government used to give for export. I was the first one to get out of it. So I think as the present, at least our company is doing enough and is going to go forward and do more.
Ben, you wanted to come in too?
I think this is a hugely important question, because this question is at the essence of the solution for the problem. If we get demanding customers that want to have a solution that is green in nature, you will have response from business. So the one thing that I would like to stress, I mean, I can give you a long list of what we are going to do as business. We're going to realize that we have to reduce the way we produce end-to-end. Reporting is extraordinarily important. If you look to safety, for example, as a great example, business routinely murdered people and called it accidents. And when did that change? Well, it changed when the board had to publish how many there were, and they had to sign off on that and publish it. Transparency is an important element to it. I can make a whole list. At the end of the day, it boils down to this. Business needs customers. Customers have demands, and business will rise to the occasion to fulfill the demands of the customers. So therefore, the question is not just appropriate, it's essential.
Shyam, do you... Yeah.
I think Harish Hyundai was being a bit modest there. I mean, the company that he has created, Selco, is actually bringing solar with microfinance to big parts of Karnataka. I mean, you shouldn't hear the story from me, you should hear it from him.
Excellent.
This is somebody who's serving customers, Ben.
Right. Did you want to come in on the tax point?
Let me just try and give a little sense of what we are trying to do, at least with the solar mission, because that is the one mission that I'm familiar with. There are two aspects to that mission. One is, unless you are able to create a regulatory framework and an incentive framework, which allows you to rapidly scale up solar applications, particularly solar applications which are connected to the grid, you will not be able to really have much of a hope of replacing conventional power. So one part of the exercise that we are doing is, how do we create the conditions whereby a promoter of solar energy, whether it is solar PV or whether it is solar thermal, can bring into existence 100 megawatt plants or 1500 megawatt plants, and that can be connected to the grid. So unless you give him a predictable regulatory framework and incentive framework, which is valid for the next several years, you will not get that scale. So that is one part of the exercise that we are doing. And I think what we are going to be putting in place will allow us to do that. But of course, it is based on the assumption that by creating that scale, you are going to drive down costs. by creating that scale and by creating those incentives, you are going to spur a lot of the technological innovation that you require in order to make this more efficient. And also, something which may not necessarily be done by business by itself, we have a very strong technology component, research and development component. What are the kind of specific challenges which the promotion of solar energy will face in India? Solar energy very space intensive. India doesn't have too much space. So how do you create solar applications which will, over a period of time, require less space? For every megawatt of power that you are producing, less amount of space which is required. Variability. In India, there is a very high solar installation, but there is a variability, because if you have in the monsoon or in the cloudy days, there will be less intensity. And so some of the things that Deepak here spoke about is very interesting if you are able to get solar cells which can also work in ambient light. So there is that kind of research which is required. Storage, absolutely key. Unless you can solve the problem of storage, you will not be able to scale up to very, very high levels. So this is the research plan that we have in the solar mission, specifically for India. Then there are those huge numbers of decentralized applications all over rural India. And not even just rural India, even in urban India. Lighting for homes, providing can we do decentralized kind of distributed generation of power and distribution of power in rural areas by having clusters of villages served by, say, one solar-based plant, or the kind of applications which are already either viable or very near viability. Most solar heating applications, for example, are already viable. What you really need is to put in place an incentive framework or even an awareness campaign in order to get people to understand that this is something that is worthwhile in terms of even saving of cost. So there are a number of things like that which are included in the mission, that we will have one related to grid applications, and there are a whole series of applications which are of a decentralized distribution kind, where the actual volume of power that you are looking at is not very large. Right. But in terms of the impact over a very large population is in fact very large. And the point that has been made is very well taken. In fact, in the fiscal structure, we are precisely looking at ways in which, if there are distortions, if there are disabilities, those, of course, need to be removed.
We're going to have to start winding up because, although we could carry on talking about this, I suspect, all morning, I'm mindful that this particular panel has really got to feed into the closing plenary and on to the Global Redesign Initiative, and seeing as you're all distinguished experts and practitioners here, no doubt some of these commentaries will feed into ministerial thoughts as people prepare for Copenhagen. So what is the key policy recommendation that people should leave this morning's session with? Let's go in order. Ben.
So I'm sorry, I stick to my action now, because if we lose the momentum and we lose, I would say also the inspiration, we will not just have a postponement of a couple of months. I'm pretty sure that if you're going to say, well, we need somewhat more refinement, or we're going to lower the bar, that there will be a huge effect on the issue, and it will go off the table for a long time to come. And I think we cannot afford that. We need the impulse to come out of the economic problems we're in. But most important, we need to have the leadership here to go and do it. I understand all the issues. I think we need leadership here to get it done, and business should speak up about the new realities in which we operate. And I think we should be a contributor to the solution.
Terrific. Suresh?
Really, one is open source the technology. Somewhere make the technology readily and freely available. Second is there are many, many corporations in the world, and they have large ecosystems, and they're big generators of greenhouse gas. So somewhere the corporations have to take the leadership role in terms of taking a mantle for reducing their own greenhouse gas emissions from X to Y. And that has to be a very well-set goal and driven passionately. And the third thing is, the awareness has to proliferate substantially. The common man, right, needs to know what the impact of his action or inaction is in context of green. I think these three things will go a long way in terms of creating a groundswell of movement on this front.
Bill Reinsch?
We can all agree on, as reflected this morning, is a sense of urgency. We really need to urge the negotiators, and I think more the politicians than the negotiators, to move on this and move on it quickly and not let it devolve into a multi-year extended effort that produces a mouse instead of something that's significant. Beyond that, I think we should also reaffirm the need for approaching the problem multilaterally in all of its aspects. This is a global commons problem. It affects everybody. And the solutions that a single country takes, while good for that country, have spillover effects, and they in turn are affected by what goes on in other countries. We all need to leap off the cliff together, and that means with respect to all aspects of the problem, whether it's intellectual property, whether it's tariffs, whether it's commitments on reductions and targets, we all need to be working together.
Shyam, Saran?
I would agree that there should be a sense of urgency, and I agree that we should not reduce our expectations. This is precisely what we have been saying. But I think it is very important to understand if this is a global commons problem, then business is certainly going to be an extremely important part of the solution, but it is not going to be the entire solution. So governments still have a very important role to play. And when you are talking about commons and you are talking about global regimes, unless those global regimes take into account the principle of equity, the principle of fairness, you will not make it work. And I think, rightly or wrongly, there is a very strong perception amongst developing countries that we are being pushed into a very unfair kind of a regime. So, in the short time that is available to us, if we recognize that there is a global commons problem, we need to be able to construct a global regime which allows every citizen of this globe a equal entitlement to the global atmospheric space, because it belongs to all of us. So unless we have at least, even if we can't do it tomorrow, unless we agree that that is where we must be moving on to, I am afraid it would be very difficult to really reach an agreement which would be equal to the expectations which the international community has of us.
Very good. Deepak?
Thank you. I personally feel, I think I endorse the panel in totality, that we should have an agreement on climate sooner than later, but let's forget about finger pointing. This is something which I'm very concerned with. He has done it, he's not doing it, we are the lowest, or this the highest. Let us work on one thing. It's happened. Let's start. What do we do from today? First. Number two, I think China and India will surprise all of you in the end of the world. The innovation will come out of China and India, because all these two countries are working very hard and in a large amount on a PPP basis, public and private partnership. Thank you.
Nick?
I think, excuse me, a clear, strong political agreement in 4 weeks' time in Copenhagen is fundamental to unleashing to their full and necessary extent the kind of private sector forces that we've been hearing about. Governments make the policy, governments create the enabling environment, and it has to be done because it's a global problem. It has to be done internationally. I think that at the moment, the problem is largely with the rich countries in terms of strong targets and finance, including, as Shyam rightly underlined, for adaptation. It usually gets forgotten, and let's just underline that. And I think in coming through with the rich country in coming through with the rich country targets and the necessary finance, I think there needs to be greater recognition and understanding of the way in which climate change action plans are being put together in the developing world. If you look at Brazil's action plans, if you look at India's, if you look at what's coming through in China, just to take three big important countries. For those of us who've been working on this for a while, the movement and the policy making and the creativity in just those three countries has been quite extraordinary over the last 2 or 3 years. That has to be understood better in the rich world. So I think if the rich world has that deeper understanding, and it's this kind of gathering that can offer that understanding, then I think their suspicion that somehow they're doing all these things and other people are doing nothing will start to evaporate. And that is a very important message from here. The developing world is doing a lot. It's part of the story in a very big way, but that has to be understood better in the rich world, and they have to respond. And there, I think, is where we need to put the pressure in the next 4 weeks.
Those are all terrific closing thoughts for a session that's been informative, educational, a call to action as we move into these next crucial few weeks before Copenhagen. So please join me in thanking our panelists for an absolutely terrific morning.